blacklist. And today he's going to talk about malware detection and all kinds of other stuff. Right?
So while we wait for this to come up, I want to say thank you for having me. I grew up in El Dorado, not too far from here. My sister got a bachelor's of philosophy from this fine university. First time I ever came here would have been her graduation. I've spoken here once in the past, thank you, George. And I'm here to talk about malware, a little bit about detection, a little bit about sort of the underground economy and the ways in which we cannot avoid it in our lives, both today and for the rest of them. So what's the answer? How many computer scientists does it take?
All of them. Still not enough.
Don't know. Full screen is where?
Down, up. Ah,
Long glasses for this distance.
I understand.
See, now it looks like the back.
Gee, it wasn't green on my side.
It's yellow over here.
All right. Hit the space bar to get forward. All right. So again, thank you for having me here. I am a high school dropout, so it's always a shock to come and sort of speak at a university. The introduction was wrong in one key aspect. Although I am known for creating the first blacklist, the first internet reputation system, I am better known for some software called Bind, which is undoubtedly running on every server you have in the university. I would rather be known for Bind than for Blacklist, simply because it's a positive activity, and I would rather be adding than subtracting to the world, even if what I was subtracting was itself a negative. So what we have here is a piece of spam sent to me by Sonoma State University in 2004. You can see the address 130.157 up here on the top line that indicates that it very clearly did come from here. It was not spoofed. It didn't actually come from Tokyo with your domain name attached. In fact, your domain name may not be in here at all. It claims to be from AOL. So what can we learn from this example? Well, for one thing, when you're selling medication over the internet in generic form to people who don't have prescriptions, that turns out to be something that the federal government's law enforcement people know how to handle. So the spamming did not get anybody in jail here, but this did ultimately lead to the prosecution of some doctor somewhere who was letting his prescription pad be used in a bad way. What else can we learn? It's possible to forge anything to come from anywhere. The internet has no authentication at all about the source of things. This appears to come from AOL, and even in now it's 3 years later, it's still not possible to absolutely prove at the time you receive something like this that it didn't actually come from some AOL system that was somehow a guest on the network at Sonoma State. What else can we learn? It was received twice in this example, and you got to read these in reverse order. It was first received by Sonoma State from somebody called 191.168. In other words, some network far from you, dovecki.com, by Mozilla, by a web browser. So what we can learn from that is that somebody around here clicked on something they shouldn't, and they ended up running a little Java applet or a JavaScript applet. It's possible, by the way, that whoever clicked on this was actually surfing pornography at the time, because that's usually where you get these infections. Anyway, that little Java applet turned that browser into a spam relay server. that could then be used by somebody who wanted to tell me about these generic drugs to get me to accept the mail, even though I've probably already blacklisted their home server, and they could not send the mail to me directly. But thanks to somebody running Mozilla 5.0 at Sonoma State, I was able to receive this mail. Thank you. Okay. This does not mean that Sonoma State is a spammer, and it does not mean that Sonoma State is in any way unusual among universities or large companies or small companies or whatever. So don't take this personally. Very similar example shows a couple of things that I think are fun. One is what we call hash busting. There's some technology out there that is designed to look at inbound email and say, have I seen this before? Or have a lot of people seen this before? If it's already been seen in 10,000 places, probably I don't need to see it here. And so what happens is every single copy of spam that gets sent out gets some English words pulled out of some dictionary and jammed together with other English words in some random order in order to make this one different from all of the other 10,000 that were sent out in the previous 15-minute period. So I've sort of edited this for clarity. Normally, a user would not see the hash busting text before and after. They would only see that if you click on this, then you'll get something cool. In this case, adware from BDE. In other words, if you click on this, then you can upgrade from the JavaScript application that's running in your browser that makes you a spam relay, and instead you can actually have it installed on the hard drive in your startup folder in a hidden folder so that you'll get it after a reboot. So otherwise, you restart your browser, you lose the functionality. So on the received, what's interesting is there's only one of them. This was received only one time. That means it was originated within Sonoma State. You didn't receive it from somewhere and relay it to me, you generated it. And so that means that in addition to clicking on something that caused you to be a relay, somebody around here clicked on something that caused you to be a proxy. So that by simply connecting to that PC again in the future, they could cause it to make any kind of connection anywhere, not just email. That's valuable because you also need to be able to reach people's IM servers and their e-commerce servers. Again, don't take this personally. I was only able to find these two examples in my copious records of things that had come from your network. On the other hand, don't get too complacent because you probably have more than one network. I only looked at the big one. What do we have here? I sent a DNS query to a Sonoma State address, 130.157. something or other. I sent a question asking a domain name service query, and I asked a question about something that was outside your network. In other words, the computer I addressed this question to had to do some work on my behalf in order to then go find this information out on the internet in order to send it back to me. Now, at a minimum, this is a bad idea because you're providing services to people who are not your customers, right? Anyone on the internet can use you as what we call a recursive name server. And you probably don't want to be providing services to the whole internet. You have no contracts, you're not getting paid. They might come to depend on it. Believe it or not, they might be able to sue you if you turn it off after they come to depend on it. There's a lot of reasons not to do it. The most important is if someone wanted to commit a distributed denial of service attack, just completely bury somebody in packets, and they know they can't send those packets from their own home network because they would get caught and arrested, or maybe they've already been blacklisted, or for whatever reason, they can surf the internet. There are only 4 billion addresses. That's not very many in today's terms. Find all of the servers willing to do this particular work, and then send a bunch of questions to those servers forged to come from the victim. And so all those servers will send an avalanche of responses to some victim who never sent a single query, but his address was used in queries that were then received. So it's better if you turn this off because you will just be part of a very big problem that is experienced. Next time somebody wants to send a denial of service attack on somebody, you'll probably be a participant. There could be civil or criminal penalties for participating, even though you didn't do it on purpose. But it's just, common courtesy if you could just stop doing this. I'm going to come back to the distributed denial of service in my final slide. So these are the open recursive servers that we found on your network during what looks like the month of August. No, excuse me, the day of August 20th. At the font size that I'm willing to put on a slide that can be seen in this room, I really can't list more than this number, but there may be more than this number. Does this mean that Sonoma State University's system administrators are idiots? No, not at all. They're doing the best they can. They have got a lot of people bringing in a lot of computers, a lot of laptops, a lot of dorm rooms, a lot of people experimenting, a lot of people clicking on things they shouldn't. It's very difficult for the owners of this network to keep from having this problem. If I tried to show you the list of people at Citibank that have this problem, it would be 10 times the size of your problem on a per capita basis. So you're actually pretty good, but you're pretty bad. So the reason you should worry about this is not that it came from your network, but that it's so representative of everybody else. Here we have flows, looks like from August 7th. By flow, I mean that we have honeypots. This particular honeypot belongs to Georgia Tech. I have a friend there named David Dagan. If you ever meet him, you should buy him a cup of espresso because he does really good work. So to be a honeypot means that we've got computers down there that are pretending to be infected PCs, and they're pretending to be victims of all kinds of things, and they're waiting to see who contacts them. So whereas the previous slide is a list of servers that are willing to perform this bit of work, this DNS lookup work that I described, even for people not on their local network. Here are some people who actually performed the work and then followed up by sending some spam or trying to infect them with a virus that they pass on whatever virus they themselves are infected with. You can get the much longer list, or you can have your sysadmins contact me, and I will put them in touch with a constant source at no charge of all the things that your network is doing that's bad. Because just as we all need to pick up litter or pull weeds in our garden, you need to pull the weeds in your network. So, what does this mean in the global context? The internet is a piece of crap. It was badly made and it's working poorly, and yet we depend on it every day, and every day we find some new way to depend on it. And even if we ourselves were to try not to depend on it, we would discover that everybody we buy and sell anything to is depending on the internet to get their trucks and trains and packages where they need to be on time in order to be our vendors or our customers or whatever. So it is impossible to avoid dependency on this thing, and it's a piece of crap. So let's go through some of the reasons. If you're making a patch cable, let's say you're making an RG58U patch cable with PL259 connectors on the end, and you're particularly good at your job, and you can really crimp it on there so that every single piece of it is a work of art, even under a microscope, then you might be able to make a coax patch cable that will fit the description laboratory grade. Because what lab grade means in the realm of patch cables is that it is so good that you never have to suspect that it is a source of signal. It's not letting anything else in, it's not taking anything out, it is keeping your experiments pure. And you compare that to mass production cables, where pretty much if you're running an experiment with one and you get a funny result, first thing you got to do is pull all your patch cables out and make sure they are not the source of the funniness that you're seeing. So laboratory grade in the realm of patch cable is a good thing. Laboratory grade in the realm of the internet is not a good thing. It means, in this context, that a bunch of guys sat down and got something working, probably in a room like this one, And there were laptops and, projectors and hubs and wireless things everywhere, and they sat around feverishly hacking all night to try and make some deadline. And then they made some deadline, they put a bunch of stuff on a CD-ROM, or they, handed off they taped out a chip, or they did something that caused something to go to manufacturing and thus get into the hands of millions of people on the basis that they were able to make it work in the lab. Okay, so I gave you a couple of slides on SMTP, which is the Mail Transport Protocol. Demonstrates that even though this technology for sending and receiving email works in the lab, that did not mean that it was ready to be used by 1 billion people. Okay, laboratory grade in the realm of the internet is a bad thing. You are using laboratory grade protocols, laboratory grade products. Everything you're doing was able to be made to work for some small number of people, thus becoming a perfectly good proof of concept that could have been the basis for a real product, but instead got shipped to you. Monoclonalism. In Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, we talked about the Dust Bowl. And the idea of this was if you had a single kind of wheat growing from sea to shining sea, then the first thing that could come along and eat that particular kind of thing or infect that particular kind of thing would turn a 1,000,000 square mile area into a wasteland. And it would be much better for you if you had planted different kinds of wheat on opposite sides of the road. And there, U.S. Department of Agriculture learned some important lessons in the 1930s about what happens at scale if you don't put some controls in to get some diversity. Okay, well, statistically speaking, you're running Windows. In fact, statistically speaking, you are running Internet Explorer on Windows, which is a bunch of lab-grade technology that has been pushed through a commercial behemoth in Seattle into the hands of 1 billion people. And it is full of security problems. It is pretty much, it's a tool that is waiting to be used by anybody who wants to use it. If you connect a PC to the internet and and it's been more than a day since you ran Microsoft Update, chances are you're immediately going to get used to launch attacks on other people. This can only happen because we have a monoclonal architecture. We have a single type of processor, single type of operating system, and a single type of web browser. This would not happen if OS/2 still existed, or if the Mac had more than a 4% market share, or if Mozilla had not been killed by Microsoft. If we had diversity, if we had competition, then the worst thing that could happen on any given day is that a quarter of the internet could be infected. And you might have a fairly good chance of not being part of that quarter. You might be part of the other 3/4. But the other wonderful thing that you get from diversity of that kind is competition. Because if one of those people can stand up and say, hey, none of my customers has been attacked for a month, then they make more money. And the other guys have to work on this. Right now, Microsoft is terribly concerned about this, and they put what work into it they can, but if they don't fix it, they're still going to sell the same number of PCs next month because you don't have a choice. By which we get to monopolies. Third weakness on my slide. I don't mean this as a Microsoft rant. If Apple controlled 90% of the market, they would be just as bad. So don't get this, I haven't met Steve Jobs, but I'm betting he's a smart guy and that I would, enjoy drinking beer with him. When you have some company who doesn't have to compete, they won't. That's good business. That's what you do if you're trying to serve your shareholders. And if you put them in control of all of the world's information and they don't have to compete, then we're all doomed. And so I remember when the antitrust lawsuit against Microsoft concluded pretty much the trial phase, and they were going to move on to the penalty phase, and they said Microsoft is an illegal monopoly and they have deliberately and with malice constrained consumer choice. And this was with regard to them having killed Mozilla. The judge then, unfortunately, overreached himself and said, all right, so we're going to break Microsoft up into pieces. There will be the operating system part and the Office part, and Eventually that got overturned on appeal, and it was found that the judge had become so prejudiced by the misbehavior of Microsoft lawyers during the trial that he had overreached on the penalties. And, you know, reading some of the trial transcripts, one can easily imagine why this judge would have been annoyed, but it was not an overreaching penalty. So pretty much Microsoft got found in a court of law to be guilty of an illegal monopoly and then was never penalized for it. And we're living in the world that is after that. I want you to compare this to the 1956 consent decree against IBM, who had been found to be acting in a similar fashion with regard to office typewriter and adding machine markets. They were penalized heavily, and they were, you know, they spun off divisions, and they actually were broken up into smaller pieces and so forth, in order that we are not all now, 50 years later, living in an IBM-dominated world. I would like the Justice Department from 1956 to come back and give us a little bit of justice. That would be good for the Internet. Vendor lock-in. I list this as a weakness, but to a venture capitalist, it is a strength. If you can, let's say you're Apple, and you can arrange that you control the player for music, and you control the store for music, and you have bottled up some of the record producers and artists and so forth so that their stuff is only available at your store, and your store is only willing to serve your devices, and your devices can only buy music from that store, then you will make a lot of money. You have locked your customers into your food chain. And Apple's stock is at 150, I think, today. But I don't think that that's necessarily good for the artists who make the music, and it's certainly not good for the consumers. And as a side issue, it's not good for other people who would like to compete in the same field, because if they don't have some kind of lock-in of their own, they can't even get investment. And so the first thing they do is come up with some patent of some kind by which they also can play the lock-in game. And the more lock-in we have, the more monopolies, the more monopolism, the more lab grade we're going to have, the weaker the Internet's going to be. And did I mention that everybody you would like to buy, sell, work for, or hire is depending on the Internet to do what they're doing, such that the worse the Internet works, the less able you will be to prosecute your own life, regardless of how much dependency you yourself have on the Internet. So spiraling, we're get to that. National security. You may have read in the papers recently that China, I'll do something here, hang on, has been accused of spying on us and spying on Germany and so forth, and we've been accused of spying on them. You may have read in the papers a couple of months ago that the country of Estonia was pretty much brought off the network by some kind of cybernetic attack, which they blamed on Russia. Okay, well, there are things that could be done in terms of either FCC rules about how you interconnect devices. I know we took a lot of those rules off the books when we separated AT&T into component pieces, but there are still some, and there's a basis for adding more. With certain things in the FCC about how you interconnect devices, certain things in the FTC about what, let's say, a home wireless gateway that you buy at Fry's, if the FTC could demand that that use encryption by default. I could tell you stories about a Pringles can. There's a lot that could be done, but there is no pressure to do it. And the people who say, gee, I want to do that, end up not getting hired. And the reason is that the idea of being able to attack someone with packets and ones and zeros instead of having to send bombs and soldiers is very attractive from a national security standpoint. This is the war that a lot of people in this country would rather fight. And so the idea of fixing it all does not necessarily appeal to everybody who is in the military-industrial complex, about whom we were warned by an outgoing president, also back in the 50s. Last, we get to this Boomtown Economy. You've been reading in the papers, I'm sure, about a housing crisis, mortgage crisis and a housing crisis. It has to do with a housing boom. It used to be possible in the city of San Francisco to buy a house at pretty much whatever they were offering or whatever you had to bid it up to, hold it for 6 months, sell it, and make 20 grand. And there were people who made their whole living that way. And I don't mean the realtors, I mean sort of serial home buyers. And I guess it's great if you're the guy who's getting the 20 grand, but eventually the house is worth so much, or the house's price is so much higher than what it's worth that somebody whose job would normally be to come in and step it up one more can't do it. So there really isn't any such thing as a profitable internet service provider. If you are buying from, I guess up here it would be Sonic.net, then it's possible they're breaking even, but only because they have more than one business, and their job is not just selling dial-up and DSL. Everybody is competing for revenue on the front end without regard to the cost of provision. So you see a continuous reshuffling of the deck chairs out there, companies buying companies, companies going bankrupt. I myself have been part of a few bankruptcies. The margins are thinner than paper. And so if somebody's got an infected PC, at least here at Sonoma State, you've got a chance. If somebody's got an infected PC and they showed up on my slides and your sysadmin sends me mail and I send you the list, that guy, for at least a few hours, is going to have nothing better to do than march up and down these halls and find those PCs and do something. Okay, that is not going to happen for your parents at home with their DSL-connected PCs. They don't have a sysadmin, unless it's you. Their ISP, if they call their ISP and say, my computer's acting real funny, it's real slow, ISP is going to be some guy in India answering and saying, I'm sorry, we can't help with that. You know, it looks like it's working from here, so we don't care what's going on under the covers. That's really where the real problem is. It's not universities infected, it is these home populations. Korea, for example, has got 1 million infected PCs at any given moment. And that's all because of the Boomtown economy. There just isn't any competitive advantage in fixing these problems. I was involved in trying to sell a service to some ISPs about 1.5 years ago where I said, I have an absolutely certain method of determining which of your customers are infected. And if you will simply sign this contract and pay this small recurring fee, I will tell you what it is. And they said, we kind of already know, because we get lots of complaints about the spam that's coming out of our network, and we can correlate those to who was logged in, and so we pretty much kind of already know that. And I said, but I have something even better, which is that once you know who it is, you can enter them into this database, and then every time they try and surf the web, all they will get is the page for their antivirus software, where before they run the antivirus software, they will not be able to get back on the internet. And what they said is that if a customer ever calls them, they have lost money on that customer, and they will not be able to make it up no matter how long that customer remains a customer. And so since I was coming up with a perfect recipe for getting their customers to call them, that I should please leave now. That's the Boomtown economy in action. Now, what kind of attacks come from these weaknesses? And they aren't direct. You shouldn't be reading left to right on this slide. I'm just not an expert with PowerPoint. Distributed denial of service attack is literally to cause somebody else to receive more traffic than their link can carry. Why would you do this? Well, certainly there are a lot of angry teenagers doing it to each other just to prove they can, or because they're angry, or because they feel like they've been insulted in some way. But you can also make money from it, because even though internet gambling is illegal in this country, it is legal in some countries, and a lot of it goes on here in spite of being illegal. It's a little bit like prohibition in that way. And these internet gambling sites, I mean, it's the perfect gig, because all the flashing lights and everything else is on somebody else's power bill. You know, somebody at home with a PC or a Mac or whatever, and they're clicking on something, and it's cards and everything. But you're playing with real money, and you have to use a credit card to buy your chips and so forth, and you can make money and you can lose money. And they don't really care who wins and loses because, like a credit card company, they make money on the transaction fees. They get a % here and a % there, and it adds up to millions of dollars a day if you're a successful internet gambling site. So one of the favorite ways that the Russian mob makes money now is not so much by going out and doing protection rackets involving breaking people's kneecaps, as it is to send some sort of a certified letter to somebody who owns an internet gambling site and says, okay, so today at 3 o'clock p.m. your time, we are going to DDoS you for 30 minutes. And then, if you have not wired us $1 million to the following bank account by 6 o'clock p.m., we're going to DDoS you for 24 hours. And sure enough, at 3 o'clock p.m., local time, the site goes down because 1 million PCs in Korea plus another, any number of countries, any number of PCs you want, will each decide that it is time for them to send 1 packet per second to the web server that serves this gambling site. And so that 1 packet per second doesn't do a darn thing to hurt your parents or whoever's PC it is. But I guarantee you that when you are, at the thin end of that funnel, it's 1 million packets per second. And there is no amount of money you can pay to any ISP anywhere. Did I mention that the margins are very thin in that game, so there's a lot of bankruptcy, so their infrastructure is not good. No amount of money you could possibly pay that would get you to be DDoS resistant. Can't be done. So, at 3:30, 3:31, the DDoS stops. You wire the $1 million. Tell you about phishing. Most of us are used to getting email from our credit card companies and our banks and so forth, telling us things like, your electronic statement is now available. You might get email from your PayPal, if you're used to wiring money over the internet, or eBay, or there's all kinds of different places that you could get email from that would not be people. And so it feels a little bit like spam, but it's talking about an existing relationship that you have with them, and so they're telling you something that you need to know. But chances are fairly good that it's PayPal with a 1 where the L should be. And if you're, of my parents' generation, or increasingly my generation, you can't necessarily tell the difference between a 1 and an L unless you get real close. And so it claims to be from PayPal, but it's PayPal. I can't pronounce it with the 1 in there, but you get the idea. And you go and you click on it, and it looks just like a PayPal site, and it says, yes, enter your password, and then you can get to your records, and we'll be able to help you with your problems. And then, you'll enter your personal identifying information and passwords and so forth, and then you'll get some error or whatever that, it just doesn't work. Maybe your computer shuts down, maybe the internet appears to get, whatever, and you try again, or you get redirected to the real site, and you say, well, I don't know what I was doing before, but I'm going to start over. Okay, well, your information just went onto a bulletin board system run by hackers and is going to be sold. And if the credit card is live and the information that you entered includes the little 3-digit number on the back of the card next to your signature, then that information is worth up to $5. Without the little 3-digit code on the back, I've never seen it go for more than 70 cents. But it all tends to go as part of fairly large batches, anywhere from 500 to 5,000 at a time. That's phishing. You have been reeled in. Spam, I think I've mentioned. I think you've all been spammed. I'm sorry about that. I thought that I was going to be able to stop spam for all time, but I think I made it worse. I think I slowed it down enough that we got used to it before it got terrible. I think without me, it would have gotten so bad so soon that there would have been laws. So you have my apologies. But you can send a lot of spam if you can infect people's PCs and send it through them. File scraping. You would be amazed at some of the stuff that is on your PC and on your laptop. Not just contact lists of your friends and family and people that should also get spammed and infected, but also your credit card number is probably there in clear text, because even if there is a encryption utility for your PC, you're probably not using it. And you probably, at some point you typed it in somewhere and it got saved in some web cache or something somewhere. And so after one of these little so-called malware programs infects your machine, it will often set off a background task to go look for stuff that's interesting and then send that upward. Your files can be held hostage. This is something that didn't really catch on because it was too complicated, and people ultimately just went and bought new computers rather than paying the money because they just didn't know what to do. They would have done it if they could have figured it out. But this is where the malware comes into your computer and encrypts all of your files with a password that you don't know. And then you get a message that says you have to pay us $45 for the password. That really turned out not to be a growth industry. I guess even the bad guys sometimes misjudge the intelligence of the victim. Key logging is one of the fascinating things I've seen, which is where instead of looking for your credit card numbers online, they just install a little callback that is in the keyboard loop, keyboard handler, so that every key you press gets sent somewhere, who can then analyze it, and they can almost always tell in context where the logins and passwords were and where the credit card numbers were and so on. So even if they don't necessarily send you to their website, they know what information you're sending to every other website. I've seen the you may have gotten a Pinpad in graphical notation on your screen to where you're trying to get into your banking site and it gives you a keypad that looks like an anti-machine keypad and you have to click with the mouse. That was because they were concerned about key logging. And so what the bad guys did is they started looking for the save unders, which is the information that gets saved by the computer when the mouse moves across the screen. And so they sent the entire stream of all the save unders as you track your mouse around. So they know exactly where you're moving and exactly what was there before the mouse cursor landed on it. There is a very interesting variant on this, which is to cause your computer, while you are sleeping, to go and log into a day trading, stock trading website and buy a bunch of shares, which then show up on your account. And they, of course, are the seller. Or they'll use you as part of a scheme to ramp up the price on something, and then they'll sell it, and you'll sell yours, and everybody will go back to zero except for them. So in addition to key logging, they can simulate key presses, up to and including typing in your PIN number and everything else that they've learned by watching you for a while. It's all done robotically. It doesn't take an Estonian teenager per one of your parents in order to get this done. Common thing to see nowadays again, I'll pick on Estonia here, is that somebody will get finally to the point where they've learned through their friends, through the grapevine, usually this will be a high school kid, how money is truly to be made. And they will set up a botnet, they'll start infecting people's PCs, and they'll start collecting some infrastructure with which they intend to conquer the world, so they think. And their ISP will notice this, and they'll say, well, that is a pure example of yet one more goddamn Estonian teenager who's setting up a botnet, intending to go into that business, and so on. Except rather than call the police, what this guy will do is call his friends inside the Russian mob and say, okay, we've got another one. And so a couple of guys will go visit that teenager and make him an offer he cannot refuse, so that his talents will be part of the greater initiative rather than him being an independent. So I hope you weren't hoping for a nuts and bolts technical talk about Stack Overflows and all the rest of it. I have one of those out in the car, but I've misjudged my audience in that case. Let me just say, any questions? We have a few minutes before we get thrown out of here.
In one of the earlier slides, you have the...
Oh, we don't.
How are you?
Hmm?
In one of your earlier slides, you had address, look like a legitimate address, not RE.
Yes.
So, is there anything that we can infer from those addresses that appear?
Pretty much no. They can be substituted to anything, so they are a function of art rather than science. And you can look at it and know the tastes of your attacker, that's all. They don't have to be, but it doesn't hurt them when they're not, so sometimes they substitute them and sometimes they don't. But it could be .ru, which is Russia, it could be KR, it could be US. A lot of spam comes through us. We have more PCs, we just don't have very good broadband. So sometimes I see these articles talking about how broadband speeds are much better in, I don't know, in England, for example, than in the US. I think, yeah, our botnets would function much better if we could just get better broadband to the home, get fiber to the home there in the back.
If you could redesign the internet, what's the number one thing you would do?
Source address verification. I would make it impossible to behave anonymously. I would make the kind of political discourse that dissidents want to be able to do without getting arrested impossible. Not because I like to see them crushed beneath the boot heel of the fascist government and so forth, but because we have to know who did stuff and where it really came from, or we have no recourse. The beginning of recourse is identity.
How would you implement source address verification?
I wish I could be glad you asked, but it's 48 minutes after the hour, so I'm going to be short. Mostly this is a matter of legislation. This is something the Public Utilities Commission needs to require of ISPs, something that FCC needs to require of ISPs. This is something that the U.S. Congress needs to require on a treaty basis about all links leaving this country going to other parts of the world. And then it's a matter of enforcing some relatively simple legislation about some relatively simple technology to just...
Basically just mandate egress filtering everywhere?
Yeah. And if you're UUNet or MCI or whatever, and you would like to install a 622 megabit circuit to some country somewhere who hasn't signed that treaty or who has demonstrated non-compliance with that treaty, then you will not be able to install that link. We are the economic engine of the globe in this country, and we have the ability to dictate terms to the rest of this big round thing that we live on, and we're not doing it. Last question. Yes.
Any comments on detection tools for, you talked a lot about
Every company that used to be in the antivirus field is now in the malware field because, that was where the market went, so they followed it. And so if you go to Symantec, or I guess even Microsoft sells this now, and you buy something that might still go by the name antivirus, then one of the things you're going to get is something that detects malware patterns as they come across your link. So it won't just find it on your hard drive like the old stuff did. It will see it on, for example, if you click on an executable somewhere and it won't even make it to your hard drive before that gets stopped. That will not catch everything because it only catches known malware, which means it takes a few days at minimum for something to become determined as bad and then put into this thing and then distributed to all the customers. So it is a weak sister to the real solution, which is to run Linux.
Okay, on that positive note,